For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Batend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. The reality in America at the moment is that each state has its own unique take on cannabis legalization. One thing that stays largely consistent among many states, though, are social equity programs designed to make sure that communities that were negatively influenced by the war on drugs, to be clear, disproportionately Black and brown men, get a fair shot at profiting from legalization. Unfortunately, another constant is that those programs mostly completely fail to achieve their stated goals.
So one of the things that keeps getting messed up when you start talking about social equity is A, if you don't get people of color the licenses, then you don't have a social equity program. And B, if you do get people of color that have been harmed by the drug war licenses and you don't provide funding, then those licenses are effectively worthless.
That's Wanda James, co-founder of Pure Life, one of the very first legal dispensaries in the country, and as it happens, the first Black person to receive a cannabis license. Lately, Wanda has been part of an effort to create a social equity program in Colorado. That's right, despite being the first state in the country to pass cannabis legalization, Colorado still does not have a social equity program. So I reached out to Wanda to find out more about what she hopes to do differently in order to achieve outcomes that reflect these programs' stated goals. Wanda, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I love talking about cannabis and cannabis.
Well, we'll do both. I actually would like to start with some of your more recent efforts in trying to pass a social equity program in Colorado. Can you kind of recap where you were in that process and how the recent pandemic has come together with those efforts?
Yeah, exactly. You know, the recent pandemic is, I mean, it's interesting. We're going to talk definitely about cannabis, but it's definitely exposed all of the weaknesses in America when it comes to our communities of color, our lower income communities, of how we have not addressed how to keep people safe and working. And so some of the issues that we've discussed in cannabis with COVID have been even more hit now that communities of color are seeing a higher instance of COVID-related illnesses. So, you know, it's interesting that when we start talking about social equity and economic recovery, social equity should be at the top of the list when we're discussing economic recovery for communities of color. I think it makes a lot of sense now.
What were some of the measures that you were helping to advocate for?
Yeah, so over the last few years, over the last decade, we have been fighting for, equality throughout the cannabis space and trying to get more and more Black and brown people involved in cannabis. So it's been, I don't want to go way back, for a whole decade, but part of the battle has been A, to end mass incarceration, B, stop the harassment of cops and law enforcement in communities of color surrounding cannabis, and C, getting people of color comfortable enough to work in the cannabis community and to own in the cannabis community without fearing blowback from law enforcement. So we've been talking about this for 10 years. This last year has been really important. We had the opportunity to work with the new governor of Colorado, Governor Jared Polis, in trying to put forth an actual social equity program that is true social equity, from licensing to funding. So one of the things that keeps getting messed up when you start talking about social equity is A, if you don't get people of color the licenses, then you don't have a social equity program. And B, if you do get people of color that have been harmed by the drug war licenses and you don't provide funding, then those licenses are effectively worthless. So what we wanted to do with the state of Colorado was to create a program that addressed both of those issues. Unfortunately, because of COVID and, of course, the huge economic strain put on every state in the nation right now and budget shortfalls, we weren't able to complete a true social equity program. But what we were able to do with the governor's office in the state of Colorado was to at least put in language surrounding the definitions for social equity. So, in other words, that a person had to be from a community, or had to be either negatively impacted themselves or a family member by the war on drugs, i.e., somebody that in your family has been arrested. B, that you lived in a lower income community or a community that has been designated a community of color. Or C, that your income fell below the poverty line during a specific time before we were giving out licenses. So those are just some of the things that we were able to get into the state definitions for social equity.
And I want to spend quite a bit of this conversation actually digging into how you view those definitions and perhaps what you think needs to be different from the way that other states have chosen to define them. But before we get fully into that, I did also want to ask, is it true that one of the other things you were able to get through is mass pardoning power for the governor as well?
Yes. So that was a gift that came late, which we were really thrilled. We were thrilled about because the governor now has the ability to pardon anybody that has a low-level, nonviolent cannabis arrest, basically for anything that would be considered legal as of today. Which, to be honest with you, just strikes the surface, right? Because in my estimation, no any interaction that you've had with cannabis or cannabis sales, providing that it was nonviolent, should be expunged from your record. But we're still working toward that. But right now, yes, Colorado, our governor, does have the ability to pardon all of those folks. And that is really key because, unfortunately, in a lot of places where you can get your records expunged, you have to hire an attorney, you have to go through the process, you have to file the proper court documents, you have to go in front of a judge. And unfortunately, most people that have been level or been hit with low-level nonviolent cannabis arrest aren't in the position to have the money to hire an attorney and to go through that type of a process. So we were thrilled that the governor is able to do it with the swipe of a pen.
And there really are quite a lot of parallels between these two conversations, that being expungement and the issue of equity, in the sense that in both of these cases, yes, on paper, technically, you could get your license expunged or you could be awarded a permit. But in a lot of cases, for specifically these groups, especially Black people, brown people, people of color, what we're seeing is that lack of access to funding, lack of access to bank loans, and all the things that you just mentioned are making it unreasonable to expect that those things will be achievable outcomes in a lot of cases.
Oh, not only do we, it's impossible to have happen because even though that everybody is talking about cannabis right now and everybody's all excited about the sales of weed in their neighborhood and all the great things that we can get from the dispensaries, it is still a Schedule I illegal drug. Which the biggest piece to being a Schedule I illegal drug means that we have no banking, we have no access to capital. So if I came up with a great business plan and had a great idea, something that everybody was going to come to and buy, and the whole place was excited about it, I could go to the SBA and the SBA could fund my business venture for me. I could go to a bank and give the bank collateral at my house or whatever else and get a personal loan. There are so many things that I could do to be able to find money to be able to fund my business, but not having that ability and selling a Schedule I illegal drug means that any money that has been invested in cannabis across the United States has come from private lending. So private lending means that I've got to know somebody with a lot of money. B, mom and dad have a lot of money. Or C, I end up with a predatory lender or a hedge fund that I end up not owning any of my business. So those are the three options that are available to you. And unfortunately, people of color, more times than not, can't go to mom and dad and say, hey, mom and dad, I need about $2 to $5 million to open my new business. Most people of color don't have that opportunity. So if you get a license but can't get funding, then that license is completely worthless to you.
Do you feel like that will give activists and interested citizens more ability to hold lawmakers accountable when it comes to expungements and taking care of people who still have these on their record?
So it's really time for legislators to step up. And the whole idea behind where we have been with mass incarceration and the sale of cannabis in our communities, and now the multi-billion-dollar industry that has been created around cannabis, it is ridiculous that people have spent lifetimes in prison for $100 of weed. It is ridiculous that I am sure, and I can't tell you exactly, but I'm sure that last night in Alabama, some kid in some inner city was arrested for selling a dime bag on the street. You know what I mean? And the reason why all of this was happening was to uphold America's slave labor class, because since this country began, we've never not had a slave labor class, and mass incarceration and cannabis gave rise to that slave labor class. As you know, I've spoken about it often. My brother was arrested for 4 ounces of weed when he was 17 years old, and that cost him, that $160 worth of weed cost him almost 10 years of his life. 4 of those years he spent in prison picking 100 pounds of cotton every day to purchase his freedom. So the cotton industry is very well invested in the fact that we have criminalized this plant for their gain. Can you imagine how much money our businesses would have if I didn't have to pay my employees? I mean, my goodness, that would just be a ridiculous. Um, slavery is very slavery makes a lot of money for companies. So, and this mass incarceration is slave labor, make no mistake about it. And choosing something like cannabis to make illegal, when it was so widely used by so many Americans, really set the stage for mass incarceration and the abuse of the legal system.
Well, let's actually go back to 2009. And I know that there's so much has happened and there's so much to cover here, but I want to make sure that we talk about your story a little bit. What was the thought process? What were the considerations? How did you end up as one of the first owners of a dispensary in America?
How did that happen, right? Um, I mean, you never set out to be the first. I mean, that's nothing that we had even thought about, or even thought was possible, to be honest with you, because, who thinks that they're the first in 2009? I mean, I wouldn't have assumed that. But what had happened, I was working as Congressman Jared Polis's campaign manager, now Governor Jared Polis. I was also appointed to Barack Obama's 2008 National Finance Committee, so I had the chance to work with the incoming president. And what I knew from my political leanings was that we were going to pass the Ogden Memo, or the Ogden Memo was going to come to fruition, which then gave states the opportunity to create their own cannabis laws. And at this point, we wanted to put a black face on a dispensary to be able to have political clout, to be able to talk about mass incarceration, police harassment, and basically what was happening to the Black community and slave labor. So we felt like having a dispensary would give us the opportunity and the voice to really be able to speak about it. And quite frankly, that's what we've been doing now for over a decade. So that was the reason we had initially gotten involved. And notwithstanding, we are serial entrepreneurs, so we also thought it would be a good business venture. And on top of that, I've been a connoisseur of cannabis since my college days. So this was nothing that we didn't know about or didn't understand. And we really welcomed the opportunity to be able to be both political and helpful to our community.
Is it true that in order to even be eligible for one of these new licenses, it was impossible if you had any sort of drug conviction or anything like that on your record? Is that right?
Correct. And this is why it's so important now when we start talking about when I have, a lot of my white friends will say, why are we giving priority to black people to get licenses or brown people to get licenses? That doesn't seem fair to me. Well, when you arrest 800,000 people a year and 85% of them are black and brown, mostly boys between the ages of 17 and 24, when you find out that that was actually a targeted, on purpose action to promote slave labor throughout the United States, then damn straight, yes, black and brown people should be able to partake of the business side and the making money side of cannabis if we paid for cannabis through slave labor, mass incarceration, and police harassment. So that's what we've really got to understand as to why black and brown people should absolutely be getting a leg up in this legal industry, because we were left out at the very beginning. Oh, and then on top of arresting those 800,000 people a year, then we had the nerve to say that, well, no, you can't be a part of this new legal industry if you have a drug conviction, which is great.
Right. Yeah. And so I also was wondering, given your political background, was there any fear on your part about making this choice? I mean, did you have to consider what the repercussions might be?
Anytime you do something against law enforcement and you're black, you're involved. I mean, oh my God, what are you doing here? And family members were fearful for us. I mean, I was like, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? You know what's going to happen to you? The sad part is, and I hate attaching this word to us, but we had some privilege. We had political privilege. I mean, I've got, I don't know, 7 senators from different states on speed dial, including the 2 from Colorado. I know God knows how many different congressmen. I just came off of the President's National Finance Committee. I've got more lawyers in my speed dial than I have family members. So because we had all of that type of backing, we felt relatively safe in being able to open up this cannabis business, and we thought we would have been free from any type of harassment. But even in 2009, we were raided, our farm was raided, um, and we faced prosecution.
What were reactions like when the news broke that you would be opening a dispensary in your neighborhood? And, what were the first couple weeks like?
um, Colorado is a cannabis state. It always has been. I grew up here from, off and on most of my life. Cannabis has never not been in and around any place. It's been very prevalent at the University of Colorado. It was very prevalent around the young professionals around town. It was very prevalent around skiers and ski resorts. Cannabis has always been, well, it's not just Colorado, but all of America, but definitely in Colorado, people have not had a negative response to Colorado's cannabis community, because even back when it was completely illegal and it was all street cannabis, even then, Colorado still had great cannabis. I mean, it's been kind of what this state has been about. So for me personally, when we opened up our first dispensary, people were elated about it. They were excited. They were curious to see, what this was going to look like and feel like. Now, as it's gotten larger, we've had certain groups, you know, um, bring themselves into the discussion that had tried to stop or slow down the sale of cannabis, legal cannabis. But Colorado overwhelmingly voted to legalize. The legalization of cannabis got more votes than Barack Obama and Governor Hickenlooper combined. I mean, it was people are very excited about the idea of cannabis in Colorado.
So I do kind of want to ask, I recently spoke with the first ever license holder, who also was from Colorado, Tom Starlacci, I believe his last name is. And he mentioned that he had some, was cognizant that there might be some like personal repercussions if he ever decided to go back into the professional world or something like that. But he said that he faced no real repercussions from law enforcement directly. Tom is a white man. I'm curious if you saw any pattern between who got raided, because he wasn't. I'm just curious if you saw. Yeah, do you know why you were targeted?
Yep. Well, we know a number of things. So, one, our first farm was in a in an industrial park. So, when you first walked in, there was office space, and then as you walked through the office space, you walked into another door, which took you out into a big bay, which was our first legal grow facility. On the wall, there was a huge sign that says this is a legally licensed grow facility or cultivation facility by the state of Colorado, with the license number and with mine and Scott's phone number on there. All of our patient records were sitting there on the wall. When North Metro Task Force came in and raided they broke down the windows. Thank God there was nobody there. They did it in the middle of the night, or not, it was about 9 o'clock at night, actually. They broke down the window. They came in with 5 SUVs, 4 deep, guys in hazmat suits, guys carrying, assault rifles, guys, ready to take down a criminal empire. We saw all the pictures since we weren't out there when it actually happened. And when we questioned what made them come through there, they said that they had reports of gang activity. The gang activity would have been my 35-year-old Black brother and my 40-year-old Black husband, which would be a pretty lame gang, to be honest with you. But I guess in
Wow.
Denver, Colorado, I guess that constitutes gangs. And then when I asked, why did you continue to go back into the facility when you clearly saw the sign on the door that says this is a legally licensed facility? And the cop says, well, we didn't know because a lot of people have been faking it. And I'm like, well, did you call the state and look up the number? Um, so it was a bunch of BS. I believe, and my husband believes, that they were hoping that they would have caught us doing something somewhat illegal so that they could have nailed us to the wall. Because by the time we were raided, we had done numerous interviews. It was not a secret. We had talked about it openly. Coming off of Congressman Jared Polis's campaign, he was the first openly gay man elected into Congress. So there was lots of press. Our name was well known. So it was really, quite frankly, bullshit on the part of the North Metro Task Force.
Wow. That's really astounding.
And which the lesson became, and we've always done this, when you're Black or a woman and you are stepping out onto an edge and you are changing things and you are leading, and if you happen to be a part of some new thought process, the one thing that I tell every woman and every person of color, make sure, and excuse my language here, but make sure your shit is tight. You know what I mean? Make sure you've got it legally tied down. Make sure that you've got it financially tied down. Make sure that all of your bank records match everything. And so we have lived our lives that way. And thank God that we did, because clearly they found nothing. They came back and they apologized within 24 hours, returned everything to us, boarded up our windows, and apologized for the raid. But had we not been prepared for the raid, it would have destroyed us from ever having this conversation today, because we would have not made it 10 years.
Well, let's talk a little bit about law enforcement, because obviously that's a conversation that's happening around the country, and I'm curious to hear what law enforcement's attitude was like in Colorado towards this new cannabis industry as it was starting, and if there's anything that you noticed there.
Law enforcement was the same way they have been. I think people think that in Colorado that we were all, kumbaya, holding hands, skipping down the green brick road together. But it wasn't. It was a battle. I mean, we had 3 governors come out against legalization. Everybody talked about how horrible Colorado was going to be if we passed this, that no one is going to move here, that companies won't have their conferences here, that home values will drop, the ground will open up and swallow up young children. No, I don't know. But they painted this picture of something that absolutely none of that came into play, right? Colorado has the number one economy. Businesses can't wait to get here. Home values are skyrocketing. Our universities have been packed with applications since we legalized. And I think it has more to do with the idea that Colorado showed that we are independent thinkers, that we are open minded. It's not so much about the cannabis, it's about the fact that we live in a society where we are allowing people to do what is of the best interest of the society and allowed the society to vote on it. So I think that Colorado has done a great job with that. I think the people of Colorado have been relatively open, but know that law enforcement and a lot of the traditional politicians were against all of this. And law enforcement fought it tooth and nail. Law enforcement still fights it tooth and nail. I mean, it's ridiculous what law enforcement will say in meetings about cannabis. They're still stuck on the fact that it's a gateway drug, which is embarrassing for them.
And, I asked that because I think that we've seen what's fair to call a shift in quite a few former and even in some cases current police officers when it comes to cannabis. A lot of permits are going to either former police officers, or the other trend that I've seen is former police officers, in some cases disgraced former police officers, starting security companies and providing private security to cannabis companies. Do you have any thoughts about this sort of public stance and kind of pushback against cannabis, something that has been extremely damaging, and the same people who enact that damage profiting off it in some cases first?
Yeah, it's I mean, honestly, it makes my skin crawl. And even when you look at someone like John Boehner, who has fought against, the legalization of
Absolutely.
cannabis all around, and he steps out and then, steps into a high paying job, and a board seat in a cannabis company, after they have voted to arrest numerous people, mainly Black and brown people. So yeah, it's pretty disgusting. It's even more disgusting when I see law enforcement wanting to, back end and get involved in cannabis when they are no longer employable. They run back here because they know in their hearts and soul that this is not the problem on the streets. They know in their hearts and soul that this is not negative by any stretch of the imagination. And they're all too happy to continue to make money off of it, whether they are anti it or pro for, you know what I'm saying? So being anti and getting money, political donations, or moving up in a police force by, arresting more and more, Black and brown kids, and claiming that they're doing a service to keeping the streets safe. And then as soon as they quit, run over to the other side and make money on that side as well by telling cannabis companies, we can help you navigate all the people that are anti-cannabis. It's really disgusting.
Yeah. And I feel like I bring these examples up like every interview that I've had for the past couple months, but I think that we have to kind of talk about this stuff, and I promise I'm kind of going somewhere here, but in the case of Illinois, I don't know how to talk about this stuff without feeling like we're calling people out, but
call them out by all means.
I mean, in the case of Illinois, we have Gary McCarthy, who is the former top police officer in charge of the Chicago Police Department, fired by the former mayor for his handling of the shooting of Laquan McDonald, the 16 shots. Like, that guy runs a security cannabis company and is working in the same industry where he locked people up for years and years and years. In Massachusetts, police made $1.1 million in overtime compensation doing extra security with dispensaries. So in some cases, the cannabis industry is agreeing to work with law enforcement, and I wonder if that comes from like political expediency, a lack of care, perhaps. Why do people choose to work with these folks?
White men hiring white men. That's exactly what that is. And I mean, I don't want to turn anybody off or get people mad at me or get a whole bunch of negative calls. But the idea is right now, you know, it's amazing. It's amazing growing up in Colorado. What we didn't cover a lot is being at the University of Colorado. And then even becoming a professional, I've never known anybody to be arrested for cannabis. Never. University of Colorado CUPD would see us rolling a pound of weed in between four kids on a Friday afternoon. They would walk by. They'd tell us to put it away. Be like, kids, put that away. Put it away. We'd put it away. Cops would walk away. We'd bring it back out, start rolling again. Nobody got arrested. Nobody got thrown on the ground. Nobody took our weed. I mean, it was just a non-starter. Nobody cared. As a young adult, after I got out of the military, I never smoked in the military. The price was too heavy for officers that consumed illegal drugs. But after the military, my friends were doctors, lawyers, business people. All of them smoked cannabis. None of them got arrested. It never happened, right? So when you start to look at how white people see cannabis and how people of color see cannabis, it's very different. So white men get into the cannabis space. They get their hedge funds, they get their $1 billion from their best friend that went to Princeton, and then they just start hiring people. And the people that they hire are all white men, so white men hiring white men, which is why we end up with white cops, protecting white-owned dispensaries. I ask if you can find any. There's only 7 or 8 of us outside of California. But if you talk to any black dispensary owners, I guarantee you that they did not hire any white police firms to protect their cannabis space. So, once again, it's white guys feeling comfortable with white guys.
And I mean, we have to talk about it because when people want change, I mean, we have to lay out the basic minimum things that you can demand or ask for from legislators in order to. And so, I mean, I guess that leads me to a question. There is a very reasonable argument for why specific language, when it comes to that definition of social equity and who that really benefits and what it's even supposed to do, there's a very legitimate argument that there should be language that gives priority to people of color because those people have, we're trying to correct something that is race-based. Exactly. So how do you fix something without doing that specifically? But, on the flip side, one thing that I have not heard at all is, has anybody ever considered precluding law enforcement from being able to have a license? Almost like you don't go for seconds until everyone else has had their first.
Man, you know what? I love that, and I have never heard that language before, but I 100% love it. I mean, I do. I mean, given the fact that, everybody from, Trayvon Martin, what did they release about him after his murder? That he was out of school because he was suspended because they found an empty bag in his backpack that smelled like weed. That got him suspended. And even down to, Botham John, the young man that was the young engineer that was sitting in his apartment eating ice cream, watching TV when a drunk cop came in, shot and killed him. And the first thing the cops release on the victim is that there was weed in his apartment, which makes me wonder, why were the cops in the victim's apartment? I mean, and it's almost, they do that so that when the trial comes up for the cop that shot and killed Botham John, they can say, taint the jury pool that, oh, this must have been a bad dude. He had a bong and some weed sitting there, I mean, it's ridiculous. Sandra Bland, we hear that she hung herself in her cell after ingesting some raw weed that she had snuck into the jail. Well, what we all know in cannabis is that eating weed, just eating raw weed, will not get you high. And the reason that it won't get you high is because cannabis needs to be heated up, decarboxylated, to be able to activate the THC in it, to be able to give you a psychotropic effect. Otherwise, if you just eat weed, you're just going to get a whole bunch of really good vitamins in your system. That's going to be about it. You won't get the psychotropic effect. So I was surprised that cops were allowed to put that through on her when the science says exactly the opposite, right? So these are the things that we see time and time and time again. Michael Brown had weed on him. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on about everybody that gets shot by a cop has weed on them. Well, it's not that people that get shot by cops have weed on them. It's that just about every American right now has weed on them, right? It's no different than having beer in your house or, a bottle of wine in your house. So, yeah, cops and law enforcement should 100% be precluded from owning cannabis businesses. I love that. But no, I've not seen that anywhere, but you're going to make me bring it up now in every meeting.
Oh no, what have I done?
I know.
Again, knock at the door. No, but I mean, it's I ask it seriously, and what you're saying is, we talk a lot about expungement, but very clearly there's a stigma that you might not have a cannabis infraction on your record anymore, and there are problems with the expungement process. It's so hard to talk about this without caveat after caveat, but like, the stigma lingers, and cannabis can still be a very powerful negative thing. And the reason that one thing that just kind of shocks me about all of this is that we talk a lot about expungement, which is the ability to have a cannabis conviction on your record be taken off so that it won't affect you in all the ways that a felony can affect somebody. But no state, as far as I understand, currently has blanket retroactive release. Like every state that has legal cannabis also still has prisoners serving time for just cannabis.
Yep. Which is crazy, right?
I mean, I don't understand why that's not the conversation. During the presidential debates, I mean, Joe Biden actually said that he supports anybody who's in prison being released, and I don't know if he actually meant that. Like, he might have been misspeak, because he was like, I support expungement, I support everybody who has who's in prison for cannabis being released. But so far that's not on the table. Like, that's not what people are suggesting. They're arguing about how to make it possible to get a previous conviction removed.
I think I'm hoping, and I like to speak about, Kamala, I hope pushing where Biden was, because, less than a month ago, he was not at this point, right, of decriminalizing. So at least they're putting in the language of decriminalizing. I think that Kamala has gone even further in wanting to set up, under the MORE Act, the opportunity for Black and brown entrepreneurs to have a stake in this new cannabis industry. So she's gone even further with what she believes, from where she's come from, on what this should look like. And yeah, it's just time, because here's the thing. How can I sit here with you on a podcast, be on the cover of various magazines, and, I sold, whatever it was, 25 pounds of weed this weekend, right? So why am I allowed to do that, yet we locked up that kid last night in Alabama? So if this is not about public safety, so unless you're going to tell me that the 25 pounds of weed that I sold this weekend hurts the population, right, then I should be in jail for hurting the population. But if you're telling me that 25 pounds of weed that I sold this weekend does not hurt the population and it's just fine and I can go on a podcast today, then why did we arrest the kid in Alabama for selling a dime bag? I'm confused. So these are the things that we've got to start to get right. And these are the questions that we've got to start to talk about, because they're just not making sense and they're not adding up.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. We've heard Donald Trump actually feared cannabis's impact on the general election. He thought maybe it would drive, if cannabis legalization was sort of on the ballot, it would drive out Democratic voters and bring out turnout. But Democrats don't seem to agree. They're not really fully embracing legalization. Clearly not as thinking about it as a winning part of their bid. Thoughts on that, if you have any, and generally your thoughts on, the decision to postpone the vote on the MORE Act?
Because the Democrats are spineless, and I'm a lifetime Democrat. And if they found a spine at any time soon, it would be very helpful for the rest of us. It really would be. I mean, honestly, I mean,
yeah.
I'm really fed up with the Democratic Party right now. I'm fed up with the spineless way that we go of everything. I'm fed up with the spineless background. And if I ever hear another Democrat tell me, well, if we do this, we might, those Republicans that may have voted with us, will be turned against us. So what? You know what I mean? Honestly, it's time to start to stand up for what's right for America, what's right for people, and also with young people. If we want to bring in a new younger generation and have people think about how politics affects their life and who they can marry and when they can have children, or what they can smoke at home in their apartment and not be, shot by a cop. I mean, it's really important that we start to stand up then as leaders that young people see value in. And quite frankly, being spineless and being afraid all the time and worried about who's going to vote against you instead of coming to the needs of the people that vote with you is just really insulting to me. And I really hope that the Democrats grow a pair at some point because, man, it's bad. It's bad. And we haven't seen anywhere in any election where cannabis on the ballot has hurt progressive values at all. As a matter of fact, it's what people want. And even if you don't smoke or consume cannabis, 75% of Americans think that people should have access to it. And once again, I think that the idea that a mom that lives in Georgia that can't get cannabis for her epileptic child unless she lives in Colorado is really, quite frankly, a shame. And I know for a fact that if a cop or a U.S. senator's kid in Georgia needed cannabis for epilepsy, I promise you that they would break the law and get it. So I don't begin to understand why, after all of these years, people are running around still afraid of what it is that cannabis can do for us and for our lives, and a much better way of recreating than drinking alcohol. Much better.
So we are officially out of time. I could talk to you for like a million years. Could I ask you maybe one or two more questions? Do you have maybe 5 more minutes for me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. As anybody who listens to the show knows, I am located here in Illinois, Chicago. We are in our first year of legal cannabis, and we're making a lot of news in the cannabis industry right now because Illinois was lauded. I mean, I saw a headline as early as 3 or 4 weeks ago that was like, Illinois is amazing when it comes to social equity. They're the standard bearer, and they've put the most thought into their social equity provisions. But in the last couple weeks, there has just been an enormous amount of stuff, from 2 contracts worth $7 million to a global accounting firm, and saying that they were going to avoid conflicts of interest in choosing who would potentially be able to get a license. And out of 937 people, 21 companies were chosen. And among those 21, one of those people is actually listed as being an employee of that consulting firm. One of them is a former superintendent of the police. One of them is a CEO of a gaming company. One of them is a well-known Chicago restaurateur. The list is very disappointing to people. There's now a federal lawsuit. I mean, I'm scrunching weeks worth of news here into one question, and I'm not asking you to comment on all of that. But I guess what I'm wondering with all of this is people are very unhappy, and understandably so, with the outcomes. And in defending the process, the governor said, yes, but at the end of this process, we're going to end up with, we're on pace to have the highest number of owners of color anywhere in the country. So I'm wondering, one, is it enough to mandate that, you just have X number of people on your board or in your company or as, hired on your staff that are people of color? And what would you do differently in writing the definitions for social equity that might get us closer to the outcomes that we say we want?
So there's a lot in that, and a lot.
So much. I'm sorry.
No. But all good questions for what's going on in Illinois. There was a lot of high hopes for Illinois. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people feel like Illinois failed where they wanted to see things happen. I think that the biggest failure that Illinois did was only give 21 companies the opportunity to have, 75 licenses, where I
Mm.
think they were hopeful that more people would have been involved in the process or were able to get licensed throughout the process. So here's the big issue that we've got going on, and I'm going to come back to Illinois just real quick. But Ward Connolly
Absolutely.
back in, and I don't remember the year, probably early 2000 or something, but Ward Connolly was able to get Prop 209 passed in California and then took it all the way across the United States. Prop 209 is what prevents any type of race-based anything. Right. So it took
Hmm.
out affirmative action in schools. It takes out, anything that is quote unquote race based. So without the ability to say, we are going to give out 15 licenses to a black owned company, a Latino owned company, and an Asian owned company. You know what I mean? Or whatever that is going to be, because we can't do that in America right now. Right.
Hmm.
So as long as we can't do that, trying to fix this wrong requires ridiculous acrobatic political BS that we have to go through. We need to have so many licenses from this area for people who lived in, this block from 1991 to 2002 and that were, harmed by the drug war. You have to come up with all of these definitions to try to make it as likely as possible that you're going to get black and brown owners, right?
Hmm.
Um, that's a flawed system, and it doesn't work. And unfortunately, with politicians and everything else, even though everybody says that, of course, I didn't know who that person was, and of course, it just happened to turn out that this person that was on the consulting team got a license. Well, I don't know how we make everything fair all the time, but I do
Mm.
know, though, that the fact that we can't make race-based happening in business, yet when we look at the arrest of 800,000 people a year, 85% were black and brown, we had no problem making that race-based, right? So it goes back to the initial piece that we talked about here is we have to remove the blind um, the blind application process, and it needs to be more merit based, because if a
Mm.
company has to stand then in front of a commission or a group of people who are actually going to, decide on who is going to get licensed in a particular municipality, they're going to have to explain why their merit base should get them, this license or X amount of licenses. We haven't seen anywhere yet that it's fair or that it's working. And as long as
Mm.
black and brown people don't control the money, we are never going to have the money for the lobbyists that are going to be the people who initially set up how the selection is going to happen in the first place. And to be honest with you, if you're not around that table, which is determining how the process is going to work, then you're not at the table. And that's the problem right now. And everybody has good words on why this is going to be fair and equitable, yet we have yet to see a program be fair and equitable. And it is amazing to me that no matter how hard we try, the same group of wealthy, white, hedge fund backed companies tend to get these licenses.
And it's particularly, I mean, it's important to mention here that in the case of Illinois, the state government really, really did encourage minorities and people of color and people who, in many cases, um, were living through the pandemic when this was going on to apply.
Mm-hmm.
And for all of those 900 and what is it, 26 people who didn't get a license, that process cost them millions of dollars.
Yep. Yep.
And that is especially relevant because the same people who are talking about the economic benefits that could come from this and how it could be a benefit to all of these people are the same people setting the number of licenses.
Exactly. People don't realize to get a license right now, you have to hire somebody to write your app for you. Your app writer can cost you anywhere between $25,000 and $250,000. In a lot of places, you have to have the property under your control, which means that you have to have a lease on the property or you own the property. It's one thing to have a lease on a property for a couple of months until you find out if you get the license or not. But this process can sometimes take up to a year, which means you're paying on a property for no good reason that just has to sit there and can't generate any money for over a year while you wait to see if you get this license. Or you have to spend millions on purchasing a property that you may or may not be able to use for cannabis if you don't get the license. We have made this process so burdensome and ridiculous because, and anytime a process is this hard, it means that we want to keep certain people out of the process, right? If it's easier to make happen, people wouldn't get left out of the process. There would be a lot of people involved in the cannabis business. I mean, why not just have somebody show what they can do and give them a license and let free market work itself out? Let somebody just go get the little corner space and open up a teeny tiny dispensary on the corner if they think that they can make that work for them. Why do we have to have all of this big money behind it? Why does Simply Pure have to hire somebody at $50,000 to write an application so that somebody in Illinois knows that we know how to run a dispensary? I've got 10 years behind that. You know what I'm saying? Give us the license, let us figure it out, open up the market, make it free market. Some businesses will do well, some will not. I.e., the restaurant industry is a perfect example of it. Most restaurateurs, unfortunately, don't make it, but there is no limit on how many restaurants can open up in a city. If you've got a good idea and you make a great bundt cake and you want to open up, Bundt Cakes Are Us on the corner, we can get you to that point. So I think it's just time that we get over the fact that this was a Schedule I illegal drug. Nobody has ever died from the use of cannabis. So I don't understand what the issue is and why we just won't let America be America, let Americans be Americans and let free market work the way that it's supposed to do in a capitalist market.
I suppose last question for you. Would you say that it's fair to, really, really liken this process to a lottery, in the sense that, many of the people who are hoping to get this life-changing opportunity, in some cases are ending up financially broken, but at the same time, the landowners, the consultants, the lawyers, the security planning teams, they all get paid anyway.
Yep. And therein lies, the ridiculous rub behind all of this, right? Honestly, if you're a good writer, the best way to make money in the cannabis business is to write licenses. Hell, you write 2 of those a year, you've made $500,000, So, it really is a ridiculous issue because the legislators have made this a huge legislative issue to be able to get a license. Do you know what I mean? All the things that you have to go through. Did the mayor of your municipality write you a letter of recommendation? Well, how many people know the mayor in their municipality? What does that take to get to a mayor? Well, I got to hire a lobbyist or hire someone that can introduce me to the mayor so I can get the letter done. So every point that you hit this, it's more and more and more money out of the pocket of the person that's actually trying to make it happen. And I guess if you've got $1 billion hedge fund behind you, that's why you got the $1 billion hedge fund, so you can pay off all these people all the way around. But then it completely wipes out for the small business owner in America. And we all know that small business is what drives the American economy. So we need to get out of the way and let business owners be business owners and let cannabis do what cannabis is going to do, especially since cannabis has never killed anybody. And there is absolutely zero reason for the overregulation and the overreach in which we are existing now in this industry.
Wanda James is the co-founder and CEO of Pure Life. Wanda, thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really, really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you so much. And I love talking about, cannabis and pot and politics is what we do. So thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at TRICHOMES.com and following us on all social media. The show is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Batend, and thank you for listening.